over there, so he can now follow up. Yeah. Simon, welcome back. So I started a self-introduction, but I'll give you a chance now to portray me, to depict me, or to picture me the best way you wish. And I'm at your disposal.
Thank you very much, Tom. And thank you, everybody, for being patient with my computer problems. This old computer is really battling to keep up with the new software that we're using and all sorts of different things that I had on the screen in preparation for this evening's meeting. A few years ago, I was at a conference in the USA, and there was a guy who was speaking there who was quite a striking character. And I said to my host, Mr. Richard A. Hamlin, who many of you know. By the way, Tom, Mr. Hamlin extends his greetings to you tonight.
Thank you.
And I said to Mr. Richard A. Hamlin, who's very well known to Valdi and his family and Louis Huttung and others, gee, I'd like to meet that guy. He said, well, why don't you just go and talk to him? I said, no, he looks like he's busy and, he's in deep conversation with important people. And I'm a bit shy, he's a sort of intimidating character. So I'm going to leave it. And Mr. Hamlin said to me, no, man, I'll tell you what, go and speak to Tom Sunic. Tom Sunic will get you an intro to that guy. It'll be easy. So off I went to Tom Sunic, whom I'd seen at many conferences and had met briefly once or twice. I said to him, Tom, I would really like to talk to this guy. And you're compatriots, you're friends. What are the chances? So Tom, without hesitation, bursts into this meeting of these high-powered guys sitting in the corner of this room, a ring of chairs, interrupts the meeting, whispers in this man's ear, and lo and behold, I've got my little audience. The guy comes out of the meeting, I have a chat with him, and it leads to a trip to Croatia, which was one of the finest things Saitlanders had ever done. And that trip was also arranged and put together, and its success ensured by Tom Sunic. So, Tom Sunic is somebody I consider a very, very good human being. He has been nothing but helpful to Saitlanders. He has enabled us to hold conversations with people of enormous power and brilliant knowledge. In fact, the man whom I met in Croatia, some of you will be interested to know, is a man who is possibly in the world today, the world's foremost expert on winning a civil war. I won't go into too much detail, but it was a fantastic privilege. All credit to Tom Sunic. Now, Tom Sunic, Professor Tomislav Sunić, is known worldwide in the community of conservative Christian patriots. He comes from a country where patriotism and nationalism and pride in who you are, your identity as Caucasian Christians, extends back 1,000 years. His country, Croatia, has been the single biggest bulwark between the invasion of Islam and the protection of European Christianity, of all of the countries, of all of the world throughout history since the first attempted Islamic or Muslim invasions of Europe. He comes from a world, from a place, from a culture, from an identity where people truly understand the actual threat to our everything. What's more, he's an academic, he's a celebrated speaker, a celebrated writer. He contributes to some of the most high-level conservative, Christian, Caucasian, nationalist thinking in the entire world. He is one of the great minds of our cause. And we've asked him to join us tonight to shed some light on a number of developments in South Africa. Professor Sunić is old enough to have lived through communism. He knows what it actually is, and he knows it as a scholar. He understands it. He comprehends it. Tonight, we'd like to challenge him with some of our perceptions. I'm just going to shift this camera if I can. We'd like to challenge him with some of our perceptions that what is transpiring in South Africa at the moment, and I'll elaborate in just a second, is, according to us, quite possibly a communist revolution explicitly directed at the conservative Christian Caucasians of South Africa. Now, what are we talking about? We're talking about the Expropriation of Property Without Compensation Act. Simultaneous to that, the National Health Insurance Act, which, as you may or may not know, will specifically be funded by people with private health insurance and not by the government. We're talking about Prescribed Assets Program, whereby the Act, Prescribed Assets Program Act, whereby private pension funds must devote 20% of all of their assets to government programs, from which they will not receive a cent back. Nobody's going to get any profit out of erecting a clinic or repairing a pothole. We're talking about the Pepuda Act, whereby the Minister of Labour is entitled to identify, I beg your pardon, not the Minister of Labour, I'll correct myself in a second, but whereby the relevant minister is entitled, or his delegates are entitled, to prosecute somebody for anything that maybe there are 18 categories of unfairness. They've made it very, very clear that you don't have to have intended to have been unfair. The other person doesn't have to have known that you were unfair, and you don't have to have done any harm in this unfairness for you to be guilty of unfairness or injustice or prejudice or discrimination. And last but not least, we are talking about the current government proposal to amend the Firearms Control Act of the year 2000, I believe, whereby no citizen will be permitted to own a firearm for the purposes of hunting, sport shooting, or self-defense, leaving practically culling, which is an absolute necessity, and vermin control in practical terms. Therefore, the average South African, the average suburbanite, will stand no chance of being able to protect himself against the burglar, against the criminal, against one of the people who have in their hands the millions and millions and millions of firearms that have been stolen from the police, been stolen from the army, and which were brought into the country in the late 80s and the early 90s by the African National Congress in what they called Operation Vula. The number of those firearms being something like, according to them, according to the African National Congress, 2 million, of which only 36,000 were given up to be destroyed in Operation Mouflon. Mouflon is the name of the operation where those arms were supposed to have been destroyed. The ANC boasted they brought in over 2 million. They gave up 36,000. We perceive we believe that taken together, it is clear that there is something that may be described as a conspiracy which will affect more than anybody else white pensioners, more than anybody else white property owners, more than anybody else white insurance, medical insured, more than anything else white business owners, and far, far, far more than anybody else white owners of licensed firearms. Thank you for your patience in listening to my long introduction, but I think it was very important to set the stage for one of the most important conversations that Suidlanders has ever held with one of the most important friends we have ever had anywhere in the world. And with that, welcome, Dr. Tom Sunic. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much. And it was a pretty lengthy introduction of yours, but it's very enlightening. And I understand that our discussion from now on will unfold in a twofold sort of a direction. I think I need to make some parallels with between South Africa and ex-communist Yugoslavia, and there are quite a few of similarities as far as this crisis, as far as the crisis in ex-communist Yugoslavia was concerned at that time. And of course, if I stray away a little bit from the topic, feel free to interrupt me. Now, I don't mind talking for an hour. And if you do not mind, I would like to first focus a little bit on the circumstances that led to the dissolution of communist Yugoslavia. And of course, I would like to provide you with some info as far as the supply in hardware was concerned back in the early 90s, and how in fact Croatian troops obtained some hardware in order to defend themselves, if I can put it somewhat diplomatically. Now, again, as I said, there are quite a few of similarities, but please, we got to make sure that South Africa is a different ball game. Croatia, first, keep in mind, Croatia is the size of Rhode Island now. Let's look at Transvaal has about 200,000 square miles, and Croatia has about 30,000 square miles. So it's really a speck on the map. But Croatia is important from the geopolitical perspective because it's located right in the center of Europe. So it's both a Central European country, it's a Mediterranean country, and partly also the Balkan countries. So we don't quite fit into the Balkans. Furthermore, keep in mind, at least for some of your viewers and listeners, that Zagreb, the capital where I live, is about 200 miles from Vienna, about 200 miles from Budapest, about 350 miles to Munich. So it's basically, we live in a sort of in a positive way, in a claustrophobic environment. It is not a huge landmass like South Africa. And our sense of space and time is quite different than my sense of space and time when I'm in the States. When I drive, let's say, down south in New Mexico, then you can go for hours without even spotting anybody on the highway.
Yes.
So another thing I would like to also clarify with you, for some reasons, I'm not very keen about using the word communism and fascism, because those words, those notions have become so watered down, so diluted, that they have become more of an insult and less of, they have lost their descriptive value. So for instance, it's a common story nowadays, especially in the mainstream media, be it in South Africa or be it in the States, or even to some extent in Croatia, also to a lesser extent, and I'll come to that, If you don't like somebody, if you don't, for some reasons, if you resent somebody, not just for political reasons, but for aesthetical reasons, then of course you will use this defamatory word fascist or Nazi, whatever that word means. And I don't like using those words in a derogatory way. The same can be said about communism. Communism is dead and gone. It's no longer there as a name, as a word, as a nomen. However, as an anthropology, as an anthropological phenomenon, as a phenomenon preaching egalitarianism and total equality, or for that matter, constant economic progress, it is still there. So my first statement is, when people ask me, even academics or journalists, when they ask me, why did communist Yugoslavia fall apart in 91? Why did the Soviet Union fall apart? Why did the Warsaw Pact fall apart in 1991? The answer is quite simple, and I will try to explain it. It fell apart primarily because many of the theoretical principles of communism had already been established in the West. This is a huge irony of history. But let's look at, for instance, ethnic sensitivity training in the United States of America in the late 80s, early 80s, when I was a prof over there. Let's look at affirmative action. Let's look at different egalitarian principles that are embedded in American legislation. All those things were once upon a time designed to be fruitful, to take root in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union. But for obvious reasons, it didn't work. It didn't work out. So yes, indeed, I must reiterate this phenomenon, this irony of history. Many of those issues like affirmative action, diversity, all those big names that you hear about in the media, tolerance, that's a magic word as well. All those concepts were preached once upon a time in multicultural Yugoslavia, but obviously it didn't work. Why it didn't work? Look, we have enough empirical example, and again, I have to keep my comments short. Multiculturalism never works. This is not my opinion. This is not my affection, if I can put it that way. I don't think of a single country. You know, Switzerland is something different. But if you look at any multi-ethnic or multicultural country, be it former India or Pakistan, or be it for that matter, Africa nowadays, multiculturals or multicultural, multiracial entities seldom work well. And this process of this Balkanization, again, a term which has become pretty much embedded in American journalism, is now in a full-fledged process also in the United States of America. But obviously, we don't want to talk about this. You know, things all must look dandy and dory, but they don't. America is also in the process of Balkanization, racialization, another term that popped up recently in the States. And yes, I do always find parallels with ex-communist Yugoslavia. Ex-communist Yugoslavia did not pass its test, actually did not pass its test twice. In 1919, after the First World War, when it was put together, 4 different nations, 3 different religions, more or less the same anthropological stature, of more or less, if you wish, of same phenotype, but it didn't work. Then in 1945, again at Potsdam, after the Second World War, Yugoslavia was again recreated, but again, we saw what happened in 1989, and 91, and 93, and 94, and 92, and so on. So keep in mind, and again, you probably know this better than I, that South Africa, the way I see it, regardless of what I may think about Mandela or the Mondelization of the country, or if you want to talk about ANC, I'm to some extent familiar with some of the issues. But again, we see now with the level of crime going on in South Africa, or for that matter, with the level of crime in multiracial United States of America. Once again, I must recap, I must reiterate, multiculturalism, this is a euphemism for multiracialism, is a failure. It's a patent failure. what Yugoslavia went through. Again, let me add, I must add that this is what the European Union will likely be going through in the years to come. In fact, what we see right now in the neighboring Germany is also the gradual Balkanization, the Germans call it Balkanisierung der Bundesrepublik Deutschlands, the Balkanization of the Federal Republic of Germany. So again, regardless of my opinion, which one may call, which you may call right-wingish or nationalist, whatever, the fact of the matter is, on a purely empirical level, multiracial countries are not functional. Sooner or later, they end up in disaster. We saw it earlier. We can see it now in South Africa. I don't want to go into those graphic details that you are certainly much more familiar with. Unfortunately, our media here in Croatia, for the matter in the European Union, do not talk about those criminal or those felonies or those crimes, those horrible crimes being committed against white farmers, women getting raped, and so on and so forth. I guess this is something we also have to bring to the attention of the wider audience, particularly in Europe and in the United States. Folks have heard about South Africa, but they don't probably get the gist. They don't get the feelings. They don't get the sense, the flavor of this ugly flavor of what actually those constructs, those multiracial constructs, end up with. Now,
if I may interject very briefly, Professor, that's the reason, or one of the reasons, why our leader, our founder, Mr. Gustav Müller, has given approval to me to endeavor to arrange for you to come out to South Africa to see for yourself, to visit people, and to speak to us. A twofold purpose to the trip. Of course, we're constrained by the COVID-19 pandemic now, but hopefully we will get it right. I just want to bring that to the attention of the audience who wouldn't know that we are working on that project.
Absolutely. I'd be glad to do that, not for monetary reasons, so please don't feel obliged, but I think it's my civil duty and also my moral duty. And I think I do have some experience. I actually spend my lifetime reading and writing. But other than that, I guess you have to be aware of what might happen. Well, it's already happening in South Africa. Very likely this may happen, sure, in a not too distant future in the United States of America, in Germany, and elsewhere in the European Union. Again, back to the topic. I said that I was going to say a few words about the dissolution of ex-communist Yugoslavia and the emergence of independent Croatia, and how, in fact, Croatia managed to salvage its independence, how, in fact, it defended itself. Of course, Croats, as you may all know, more or less, are very Catholic, very conservative, very law-abiding, very religious-abiding, very papal, if you wish, nation. But by and large, you don't win a war by pious preaching or by going to your bishop or to your priest or to your local Pfaffe, as the Germans say. When you fight the war, you need something tangible. You need something. You need something palpable in your hands. And of course,
I'd just like to point out for the audience's benefit, I beg your pardon, Professor, I think I'm going to interrupt you on a few points from time to time, if I may, just to help the audience to understand. Yugoslavia means, and please correct me, Prof, if I go wrong here anyway, South Slavia. So it's the southernmost of the Slavic peoples of the world.
Right, which is a very generic term because it can mean everything and nothing at the same time. It's really a geographic term. It's not a term denoting a nationhood. So basically, yes, quote unquote, Yugoslavia, communist Yugoslavia was quote unquote a federal state made up of 6 different republics. And all those 6 different republics harbored, they in fact encompassed different peoples. Like the Serbs, in fact, the Serbs, they made the majority in Yugoslavia, about 40%. They did hold a relative majority in Yugoslavia, but they did not have an absolute majority. And of course, going back to the First World War, I don't want to pester you now with those details, but unfortunately, you got to look at those historical contexts if you want to understand this bust up of this artificial state.
I think it's vital for the audience. I mean, if I didn't know what I know about Yugoslavia,
let me just continue. After the First World War, Croatia was part and parcel of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, both on the cultural level, both on the psychological level, on the linguistic level. Croats have been very close to the Germanhood, we can say, to the German culture, to the German people. And up until the end of the Second World War, the German language was the second official language even in the first former Yugoslavia, and in Croatia itself, in schools and so on. And I'm very much imbued, and I'm also impregnated with the German culture, because be it as it may, we are next door neighbors. Slovenia, Croatia, Austria is next door. So yes, after the First World War, given the fact that the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the German Empire, fell apart, and Croatia, being part of that ex-empire, ended up defeated, and Serbia was on the other side. Serbia was at that time a small state, but it was independent. It was fighting on the side of the British, the Americans, and of course the French. And the French diplomacy played a crucial role in 1918, 1920, at Trianon, and later on in Versailles, after the First World War, in putting together this artificial state of Yugoslavia. Why? Why did the French insist on doing that? Because the French politics, again, I got to dip into history now. Going back to Francois I, I hope you speak some French. We can do it in French as well. It's a beautiful language, but very lousy politicians, the French politicians, ever since the 16th century. Since Louis XIV, since Francois I, Louis XIV, they tried to compound, they tried to contain Germany and Austria. So this is the reason why almost until the Second World War, and even later on, France was very belated in the recognition of the independence of Croatia in 91, 92, 93. Mitterrand was actually a friend that was pretty much in favor of the Serbian cause, of the Serbian centralized hegemonic state. So yes, the Serbs, being on the good side of the history, if you wish, they all ended up as architects, we can say, as state architects of this first monarchic Yugoslavia, which fell apart in 1941. And then again, what happened to Croatia? And again, I need to focus a little bit on the stigma, just like all white nationalists are being stigmatized. Croatia, was after the first, prior to the Second World War, there was already a strong tendency among Croatian nationalists to separate, to bail out of the Yugoslav pro-Serbian state. And of course, during the war, Croatia was declared independent, of course, with a great deal of help by the Germans. And yes, indeed, Croatia remained for historical reasons. So you remember what I said earlier? It was part of Austro-Hungarian Empire. Many of those famous National Socialists, including Hitler himself, he was an Austrian citizen. He knew very well what Croatia was all about. So yes, the stigma that I would like to focus on is that during the Second World War, Croatia officially was a pro-national socialist state, pro-fascist state. I don't want to call it fascist because it was quite different than, for instance, the Italian fascism or the Franco-fascism, but it was certainly a very valiant ally of National Socialist Germany. And even when Germany surrendered on the 8th of May 1945, the Croatian nationalist troops, pro-German troops, they continued their fight for weeks and weeks, particularly in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And even later on, when the war was over, and even when those big massacres occurred, when actually Croatia lost its gene pool, I don't want to now go into those victimhoods because it may be tiresome for some of your viewers, but Croatia suffered a severe loss in its gene pool because the massacres, the communist-led massacres that occurred in 45 and 46 in what became Yugoslavia, communist Yugoslavia, are just beyond description. Beyond description, I would certainly I wouldn't mind suggesting you some books, some more or less some objective books where you can trace actually this topography of death that was involving the loss of the loss of lives among ethnic Germans. Yes, about 500,000 Germans lived in Croatia during the Second World War, ethnic Volksdeutschen, and of course many Croats, including our intelligentsia, was wiped out. So yes, basically even we feel this crunch, this loss of intelligence, if I can put it somewhat simply, in a very severe fashion right now. So be it as it may, it just gives you an idea that the stigma of fascism has been deeply bothering not just me, but many Croats, even the current government, which is certainly not fascist at all, which is very much left-leaning. But Croatia has been, or was rather, during the whole Cold War, has been stigmatized as a fascist, as a philo-fascist state, as an anti-Semitic state, and so on. And even Croatian nationalists, even Croatian expatriates in South Africa, and in Australia, and in Germany, and in Argentina. Keep in mind, the digression, Croatia has a huge expatriate community, huge diaspora all over the world, over 3 million people of Croatian ancestry living scattered from Sao Paulo in Brazil to Santiago de Chile in Chile to Sydney. I mean, there are huge communities and people who don't even speak Croatian, but who nonetheless feel whose sentiments are very much pro-Croat. So this gives you an idea that this constant demonization, this criminalization of the Croatian people left its traces during the Cold War. And of course, this had a terrible impact in 91, 92, when Croatia declared its independence. The European Union, I'm trying to put this all in the context, which was launched about the same year when Croatia declared its independence in 91, was not favorable, I must recap, was not favorable at all to Croatia's independence, the European Union. Why? Because to some extent, Yugoslavia was a role model, a multicultural role model for the future European Union. So my second conclusion is, if somebody is really to be blamed for this prolongation of the conflict between Serbs, communists, and so on, it was the whole mess going on, I would certainly put it squarely on the shoulders of the European Commission, which did not do nothing, which did very little in order to stop the conflict in what was then, the early fledgling Croatia in 91 until 95. Now, as far as the hardware is concerned, I presume this is something that some of your viewers may want to ask me. I must say that given the circumstances and the geopolitical vacuum that occurred in the early 90s all over Europe, things were to some extent good for us. I must say that certain services, certain agencies, even in the United States and in Germany, despite the official eulogy of how to preserve Yugoslavia, they were quite favorable. In fact, they were sympathetic to some extent to Croatian nationalists, and also, of course, to many Croatian expatriates, especially from I'll mention some folks from South Africa as well, from Australia, who showered, we're talking about billions of dollars, and both in hardware and in humanitarian assistance to Croatian fighters, to early Croatian government, and so on and so forth. The name, it's not a secret now, it's long gone, it's 30 years now. You may probably recall, I don't know if some of your viewers are familiar with the name Tvrtko Mursalo. I knew this gentleman. He was a very, well, I don't want to say wealthy, but quite an important businessman in South Africa. He was an expatriate Croat who left Croatia, ex-Yugoslavia, when the communists took over in 45, and he settled down. He made a big career in South Africa. And he was actually, I remember quite distinctly when I was in the States, I was writing pieces and articles for immigrant Croatian journals. He was financing some of the Croatian journals, expatriates, immigrant journals in a Croatian diaspora. And he was actually the first ambassador to my knowledge, the first Croatian ambassador in the late 90s, mid 90s in South Africa, in Pretoria, I think, yes, in Cape Town, yes. Tvrtko Mursalo, Mursalo, a very good guy anyway. I think he passed away quite a couple of years back. So yes, indeed, I must again tip my hat to my colleagues, expatriate Croats, because I include myself in this group, because they were quite active in lobbying, both at the State Department in the late 80s, early 90s, when Croatia declared its independence, especially in Australia, in Argentina as well. In Argentina, there is a huge Croatian community, mostly children, kids, progeny of people who had to fled communist Yugoslavia in 45, 46, because of, what happened after the Second World War. And yes, in Germany, there's about 500,000 Germans of Croatian ancestry. They also massively helped with be it hardware or medications and so on and so forth. You mentioned some names, including a friend of mine, General Glasnovic, who actually grew up in Canada. And yes, so why should I knew the guy. He was our first Minister of Defense, was a Canadian Croat. Gojko Sušak, he was a Canadian Croat. And of course, with his ties, I don't know all those details about the ties, but he played also a certain role with certain services, with certain agencies, both in the States and both in Canada, for actually enabling Croatia to shed this communist and Yugoslav heritage and actually to preserve its independence. It was actually, as I said, very harsh. It was very difficult. As I said, I put the blame on the European Union, which is still not, I'm not quite certain what this European Union stands for. I guess I could give another lecture, if you don't mind, one of these days, just on the failure of the European Union, because the European Union, allow me this digression, it's basically a trade transfer union. It's basically a trade corporation. It's not a political entity. They don't have a strong, unified foreign policy. And look what happened with the Brexit, look what happened with the UK. And hopefully, not that I'm engaged now in wishful thinking, but I think it's going to be soon the case with Italy and probably Greece in the years to come. So be it as it may, yes, it was probably by default. And of course, keep in mind, as I said at the beginning, this geopolitical vacuum that had occurred in the entire Eastern and Central Europe in the early 90s, that enabled Croats, and especially Croatian expatriates, who actually played a crucial role in legitimizing, so to speak, his historical demands, appetites, if you wish, of Croats to establish their own sovereign state. Despite this huge burden of stigmas that we have inherited from the Second World War, because, as I said earlier, Croatia was the last ally of the Nationalist Socialist Germany in late May 1945. They fought to the last, and of course, not for National Socialist reasons, it was a conservative Catholic reasons, but of course, Germany was at that time the only game in town. So again, I don't want to get too philosophical. I guess we can start this conversation on a somewhat different level. There are always things, there's in political science, we call it a process of unintended consequences. It could have turned out different. Keep in mind, America, ever since Truman, since 47, 48, 45, rather 47, 48, and of course, the European Union, in fact, even earlier, Europe, they had not been prone, they had not been sympathetic about the dissolution of Yugoslavia. They wanted to keep this country on the map, on the land map, for obvious pragmatic reasons. Why? Because the Balkans has traditionally been, this area of the world, this area of Europe, has traditionally been a very volatile area. There are still troubles now in Bosnia and Herzegovina going on, the neighboring Bosnia and Herzegovina. There are still three constituent nations who don't talk to each other, literally, It's basically an artificial state of affairs. And of course, for the time being, it's fine. There's no war. It's fantastic. I'm now on the coast. There are plenty of foreign tourists and so on. But you never know what may happen next. Again, allow me another digression. When you look since the 30 Years' War in the 17th century until now, We have had wars here in Europe every 40 years on the average. So regardless of the situation now with the big replacement, and we can talk about this ethnic and racial replacement in a while now and draw some parallels with South Africa. The situation is stable all over Europe. It is very stable in Zagreb. You can jog late at night. You're better off and you're safer than in Pittsburgh, or for that matter, let alone in Durban or in Sydney. It's fine. It's all white. It's fantastic. But you never know what might happen 5 or 6 years, what will happen 6 years down the road. I guess I don't want to stray away too much from the topic, sir. And if you want to focus more specifically on a subtopic that I may have missed, that I may have skipped over, please do let me know.
100%. Prof, I've allowed you to digress and to speak at such great length because we in South Africa, sadly, don't have the tradition of intellectual conservatism that exists in other places, such as, for example, the United States of America. Now, this is not to self-deprecate. I'm not saying that we don't get anything right. The reality is that Sakelanders, my organization, the organization founded by Mr. Gustav Müller, is the largest organization of its kind in the world. And moreover, it is one of very, 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 very few organizations on the right anywhere in the world that is explicitly Christian. So there are some things that we do get right very well, very much better than anybody else in the world. But there's some areas in which we're a bit weak. And in South Africa, if you speak to somebody about Franklin Delano Roosevelt being among the most wicked communists of history, to oversimplify, but an agent of communism, they blank over. We don't understand this in South Africa. We don't know this stuff in South Africa. That's just to illustrate the principle. But you've been speaking and enlightening many people, I'd like to believe, on ideas and themes with which are more or less alien to us. These conversations are held well in Germany and in Croatia and in the United States of America, but it's never been what we've mastered in on the right-hand side of the socio-political spectrum in South Africa. So, yes, I would like to pull you back to the theme, but I want to emphasize that I appreciate very much the lesson that you've given, which will come as news to very many people. Professor, you are familiar with communism. I understand when you say that the term is perhaps defunct or it has been shorn of its value. But of course, for us, we laymen in South Africa, we don't have such a sophisticated lexicon to address the nuances of these things. Obviously not. So I'm going to keep it a little bit simplistic by your standards, if you don't mind me doing so. You were familiar with the system known as communism. You experienced how it's managed, how it's conducted, what are its facets and elements and natures. And I think we'd like to hear from you about this. We're trying to draw parallels, and the only parallels that we can find are parallels to communism. When you have a government that says, we are going to pass a law whereby we may dispossess you of all property without compensation, end of story. We are about to pass a law which will dispossess you of all of your right to defend yourself against whatever, burglars or the state or whatsoever the case may be. We're going to pass a law whereby you will pay as private people effectively for the government's health service. Specifically, this is not an exaggeration of the concept. It is explicitly that. The people, the private medical aid funds will fund the National Health Insurance Initiative. Simple as that. We're grappling with this thing and trying to make sense of it. And I suspect that you can enlighten us on some parallels, some similarities. You may give us a better idea of whether we're barking up the wrong tree by seeing this as some kind of draconian communist thing, or whether perhaps we're on the right track. Over to you, Professor.
Yes, sir, I can see that you would like me to focus a little bit on those administrative things regarding the healthcare and whether it should be privatized or whether it should be state-run, as it still is in most of Europe. In the United States is something. It's a different story. Even in the UK, in Croatia, we still have a state-funded healthcare, and it's not probably ideal, but it's certainly much better. At least you have a sense of security, which most people probably in the United States don't. Now, however, keep in mind, in order to have a state healthcare run by the state, you more or less you need a homogeneous people, which is not the case in the United States of America, where 55% of people are of European ancestry and 45% of our non-European ancestry. So, of course, I mean, I could tell you stories about that because I was in a hospital in the United States of America, and just for a simple tooth extraction, I had to pay big bucks, Whereas I know very well, that I remember, I got to tell you that I went to see the doctor once in the Sacramento. This will illustrate best. And I asked the lady, well, what does it cost so much? What does it cost $1,000? She told me, well, why don't you swim the river, and then you will not pay anything. And I didn't understand what she meant by swimming the river. In fact, what she meant by swimming the river, why don't you become an illegal Mexican, Mexican or Latino immigrant, and just come across the river, and then you will have a free Medicare. So keep in mind that the United States of America, despite the fact that it doesn't have this state-run healthcare, spends more money on Medicare than any other country on earth. So this is an irony of history. Again, let me just backpedal a little bit, if you don't mind. We mentioned this concept of communism, and by the by, I hope I'm not using a very arcane language, sir, and for your listeners. And I certainly would like to simplify my narrative, as they say, my discussion, as much as possible. Although I must tell you, folks, in order to understand all those nooks and crannies of what happened in ex-Yugoslavia and what's going on in Croatia, you need to have some historical background. So again, keep in mind that despite the fact that communism is dead and gone, I mean, this Marxist principles, there are very few people who read Marx in the first place. As far as communism as an anthology is concerned, it's still live and kicking. What I mean by communism, and I'm using this word in a very neutral and neutered way, if you allow me, is this egalitarian drive, this obsession with equality, this obsession with affirmative action. Again, I could talk about affirmative action in the United States of America because it reminds me of the same affirmative action we had back in communist multicultural Yugoslavia. We're very stupid, if I can say, very, very low IQ people, provided they were in the Communist Party. They had, of course, free access to the higher echelons of the Communist Party. And this was the law, and you had to abide by it. Just like in the United States of America, most institutions, they have to abide by affirmative action, by this ethnic sensitivity training. So this is definitely a communistic, I use the adjective communistic trait. It's still there. And yes, I'm not ruling out now with this surge of Antifa movements and pseudo movements in the United States of America, that the country may be gradually just moving over, morphing into some sort of a pseudo communistic type of entity. Even the modern conservatives now, whatever you want to call them, there are no more traditional conservatives in the United States of America. And even in Croatia, I noticed this trend of neutered language among conservatives and other than some nationalists. There is also this tendency of cutting a deal with communistic, not necessarily with communist iconography. It doesn't exist. Again, let me add, this communist iconography, you know it. It was red star, hammer and sickle. They're now dead and gone. But what you have instead is what? You have the Rainbow Coalition, which is just a different nomen, which is a different substitute for basically the same egalitarian thrust. I think I make myself quite clear to your viewers and to your leaders. In fact, in Germany, if you follow the genealogy, okay, let me put it that way, the pedigree of most leftists and most what they call them grüne, the ecologists, you will find among them, you will detect among them former Marxist scholars, former Marxist fanatics, if you will, zealots, who of course have realized by now that posturing and disposing and what do you call it, displaying the Marxist symbolics simply doesn't work any longer. It's outdated, it's old-fashioned. But instead of that, they resort to what? To the transsexual sort of escapades, the different lifestyles. This is just I would call it a proto-communistic or crypto-communistic type of a egalitarian drive, which, as I said, it failed. It brutally failed in 1989, 90, with what happened in the Soviet Union, fell apart, communism and so on. But this thrust, this egalitarian thrust, that we are all equal, that we can change our sexes, that we can change our genitals, if you want to put it that way, that we can actually, from the rags to the riches, that we can all have the same IQ. This is another hoax. This is the biggest hoax of the century. We know very well what the IQ is of folks in Somalia and Ethiopia, and I know very well what the IQ is of folks in Frisia and Friesland, for that matter, in northern Sweden and so on. So again, this egalitarian drive has not disappeared. It is still there. Of course, as I keep saying over and over again, I'm sorry if I'm repetitive. It just has a different garb. It has a different cloak. It has a different attire. It has a different veil. So when I meet look, I guess I'm not talking from the top of my head. I don't want to go into my pedigree. I lived long enough with the communists. I myself, I was a hippie. I traveled in India in 71, 72. I was probably right-wing hippie. I lived with them. I did all those things, we smoked dope and so on and so forth. So I know the spirit of those guys. I know them back when I was a grad student in California. I lived with them, I know those guys. They're very dangerous. They're not necessarily bad and evil, but they just wallow in those self-delusions and their self-denial. And this is the biggest problem with the left. And this is the problem not necessarily with the ANC in South Africa. This is not the problem. The problem is at the American academia and Western academia, where those ideas generate themselves. Who actually destroyed the apartheid system? Who actually kicked out Vorster? What was the last, Botha, who actually delegitimized South Africa? It was not the ANC, it was not Slovo, whatever his pedigree is. Slovo means in Slavic languages a letter. He was different, a letterman. You know who I mean, Slovo, the guy who was actually the big advisor to this guy, and we know about his pedigree. But the problems originated back in the early 80s in American academia. And they actually hailed as a priest, as a sainthood Mandela. They made a giant, a spiritual giant of him, just like they did in the States 20 years or 30 years back when they instituted Martin Luther King, who was a plagiarist, by the way, was not a big intellectual, or just like this guy Floyd. Again, now I don't want to get carried away and talk about the transvaluation of all values. I'm an expert on Nietzsche, by the way, Friedrich Nietzsche. So please do read this thing, The Genealogy of Morals by Nietzsche, and you will see that what we are dealing here is a total transvaluation of all values, where you have a felon, where you have a drug dealer, where you have a guy who committed several criminal acts, who is now being hailed as a future saint of the United States of America. So this is all what I call a crypto-communist thrust or drive or sentiment, which is pretty strongly embedded, unfortunately, not so much well, not among politicians as of now. Yes, by now, pretty much there as well. But in academia all over, there is no way whatsoever, despite my language skills, despite my PhDs, despite my books, there's no way whatsoever I could get a job as a professor back in the States now, because what the United States of America is going through, and to some extent, this is now gradually seeping in Croatia as well. We're still better off than the States. This affirmative action, this negative discrimination, you know very well what I'm talking about. In America
Yes.
now, and again, we are basically being discriminated against. I hate using those big words, and I don't like it. I think it's counterproductive, like white power or this or white genocide. This is probably a hard-pitched word, but yes, we're definitely threatened. And again, those I blame most are not blacks. In Angola, if you wish. Look what happened in Rhodesia. Look what happened in Angola. Look what happened in Mozambique and the neighboring countries. But those I blame are those whites, mostly whites, who live in self-denial or who live in a self-censored mindset, like most young Germans, who, of course, for historical reasons, they have to expiate the crimes of their grandparents. And now they want to prove to the world that they are more papal than the Pope, that they are more liberal, that they are more, if you wish, crypto-communist than communists themselves. So this is a typical German neurosis. And this German neurosis now has spread all over the white world. Again, I don't want to sound that pessimistic. So basically, the only solution I see is, of course, you mentioned Südländers, the people who are racially aware, who are not afraid and who are not ashamed of their roots, of their culture, and who the same goes for the Germans, the same goes for Croatia. And as I said, again, let me just finish this sentence, then you can interrupt me. I'll be more than happy to accommodate 2 million white Afrikaners in Croatia. They could be of great help to us. They could boost our natality. They could actually, the people of high IQ, they could help us, jumpstart our economy, our industry, and so on. Again, I'm probably moving away from the topic you mentioned, the healthcare system. For the time being, it functions. But let me just dismiss one big myth. There is a myth that has been conveyed over the last century that fascism was the last form, the last offshoot of capitalism, and that fascists use capitalists as their useful idiots. No, it's exactly the opposite. Even Trotsky wrote, you got to read some Trotsky, you got to have to read communist enemies as well. You have to know what your enemy thinks about you.
Well,
basically what you have right now.
As you mentioned,
let me just finish this sentence, and then you can go on. Basically, if you look what's going on right now in the States, and to a large extent in Germany, the big capital, the financial capital, works hand in hand with those street felons, if you wish, with the Antifas. Who finances those Antifas now? Well, now look what's going on in Oregon, in Washington. Look what's going on in Germany with different leftist groups. They get big bucks, they get big money from different governmental institutions, including from big companies. This is something you got to keep in mind. Soros is just one. He's one in this huge mosaic. There are many other Soroses as well. Soros was quite active in Croatia as well. He was trying to dismantle the first government in 91, 92. I know it firsthand because I was a diplomat back then. So I know very well about his mechanisms of toppling the governments and so on. So yes, you have big capital, financial capital, and you know in whose hands it is, working hand in hand with those street fighters, with those trannies, with those, drag queens and sexual deviants and so on and so forth. I'm sorry if I'm going too far. I just want to give you an idea. This is the main line. Communism as a name, as an acronym, is dead and gone, but it now surfaces in different offshoots, in different vocables, if you want to put it that way, in different verbiage. I guess I made it myself clear. Let me know, Simon, if I've made myself clear.
I think so, Professor. And I think that is, although we've been a bit oblique to the topic tonight, I think that's kind of what we're perceiving. We're perceiving the introduction of social systems and laws and modes of community that are not being advertised or promoted or labeled as communism, but which are tantamount to something like communism for all practical intents and purposes. And I just want to touch on, you mentioned Trotsky and you mentioned Antifa. It's worth telling the audience that Antifa takes its name from the Antifascismus, which was an organization founded by the Russian Trotsky in Germany in the 30s, specifically for the purposes of waging war on the streets. You can go and look it up. It's an explicit and specific thing. I don't want to be too over-emphatic, but it is so clear, so unambiguous, so incontrovertible and irrefutable, yet so few people know it. This is an organization that derives its identity from a martial, a militant organization founded by one of the great architects of practical communism, not the architects in the 1840s and 50s when Marx was writing the Communist Manifesto published in 1848, but the architects of the practical implementation of Marx's work in Russia. And again, these connections are so important, and it's so valuable to have somebody like you here to talk about these things, to draw the parallels, to illustrate, and to uncover things that are otherwise not easily uncovered.
You're quite right. You mentioned a while ago, I guess in a somewhat self-deprecatory, if I can put it that way, that there are not too many intellectuals, there are not conservative scholars in South Africa. Listen, again, to some extent, you can apply the same sort of analysis when we talk about conservatives in Croatia, for that matter, in Germany. Yes, of course, we are better off. We have a certain heritage and so on and so forth. But by and large, let me tell you, I'm not happy at all with the strategy of what they call them cuckservatives among Republicans in the United States of America. This is probably the major failure of former President Trump. He actually focused very much on cleansing, if you wish, the feds and different administrations and federal administrations and so on. But he actually should have focused, well, of course, he didn't have lots of margin of maneuvering. He should have focused more on cleansing and demarxizing or decommunizing American academia, which is now full-fledged crypto-Marxist, crypto-communists. Of course, they don't call themselves crypto-communists, but they're definitely into this affirmative action utopia, into this multiracial type of a brave new world, into this la-la land, call it whichever way you wish. This is dangerous. Eventually, it will fall apart. We know that. Let me also make a statement which is almost like my meme in a way. Even if, let's say, the bad whites, we are now all stigmatized as bad whites, disappear in South Africa, and even if all whites, who are now being demonized on all wavelengths, on all pages, on all frequencies, 24 hours, 7 days a week, even if we all disappeared as a white, rest assured that racial conflicts will continue forever and forever and ever. If you know this firsthand, come on. If you see a Chinese American, you would never see in San Francisco, in Vancouver, a Chinese American girl dating a Hispanic or dating a African American. You would never see a Jewish American dating a Black American girl and vice versa. Very rarely, yes, you will. In American prison systems, you will notice right away that, hopefully not, but if you end up in a prison system, you have no other option but to join your tribe if you want to survive, literally. And of course, the Hispanics, the Latin Americans are not very on good terms at all in LA with the African Americans. And the Chinese Americans have their own tribal interests and so on and so forth. So my point is the following. even if, let's say, the whites, let's say the Germans who are now suffering under this terrible neurosis, historical neurosis, completely brainwashed people altogether, both institutional and psychological. Even if they were all now admixed, or even if they all disappeared, rest assured you would have gangs, different gangs you hear every day in the newspapers, in German newspapers. If you read the German newspapers, the Lebanese gangs in Kreuzberg, in part of in Berlin, fighting against the gangs from Africa, with Somali gangs. But you rarely ever hear about that in the newspapers. I'm sure you are certainly more familiar than I am. I'm sure what is the major tribe, the major people? Xhosas and Ndebele, right, in South Africa, if I'm correct, right, Simon? So I presume they also don't have good relationship at all. Ndebele, they're different, 17 different people, 17 different tribes.
It's the Zulus. Professor, it's the Zulus.
And of course, they all have tribal interests. When push comes to shove, I saw it firsthand with former communists, former hardcore communists in '91, who from Yugoslavs turned into hardcore nationalists. Why? Because they wanted to protect their butts, And of course, they needed the help. They needed the assistance of Croatian volunteers and Croatian expatriate volunteers and Croatian and foreign volunteers. So yes, this biological, let's call it in a somewhat derogatory fashion, this tribal sentiment, I'll call it, as Garrett Hardin, a great sociobiologist, my former mentor at University of California, used the term territorial imperative. You all have territorial imperative. You have your tribe, you have your soil, and of course you have your blood. Listen, let me give you an example for just some Joe Sixpacks, if you wish, nothing big. If you visit, let's say, Africa, I lived in Algeria for a couple of years when I was a diplomat. So when you visit an African country and you go to some expensive, classy hotel, and when you observe a little bit the European people or European guests or tourists who check in, you will notice in their eyes that they look for eye contact with their lookalikes. They're looking definitely, the first thing when they enter the concierge, when they come to and check in, is they just go with their eyes and they look for their European lookalikes, because this is a tribally inherited impulse among all of us. If you go to let's say the United States of America, the first thing you look at, anyway, those issues,
I know that phenomenon very well. I've traveled in Africa for business and work extensively.
So you understand,
and it is a very, very well understood thing. If there are only two white people in a hotel of like the Echo Hotel in Lagos, which is something like 990 rooms, enormous, absolutely enormous hotel. If there are only two white people there, guaranteed within an hour and a half, they'll find one another.
Absolutely, that's the way it is. So again, let's go back. Let's just backpedal to this trannies and to what you call it, transgender type of a proto-communist thrust. That's what I call it. Actually, when somebody talks, who actually hails and eulogizes about transgender studies, he's basically using a different acronym for what? For crypto-communist Trotskyist type of a mindset. This is what it's all about. It failed, the Gulag archipelago, the Gulag topography did not work well. Now they're using different forms of conflict and different forms of hybrid war, which is far more pernicious, far worse. Let me tell you why. At least, let me tell you why. I'm a city boy. I grew up in communist Yugoslavia in a large city in Zagreb. So we went to the church, because this was just about the only place where we could crack jokes about communism and so on. We were all under surveillance, definitely, but it was more or less allowed. So yes, our privilege was that we could decipher on a purely physical, anthropological, if you're a phenotypical level, we could decipher a communist from 200 yards. And this is not a joke. We're trying to compete. Could tell the guy, oh, this guy looks like a communist, So when we're kids, 12 years of age, so we knew by the shape of their nose, by the shape of their square head or something, by the way they talked, the way they walked, we know that they were communists, that they were snitches or spies or whatever, spooks and what have you. Now, the problem with the liberal system in the United States of America and Western Europe, especially in Germany, you no longer know who your enemy is. You can no longer define and decipher your foe, because they've entered now first and foremost into the federal government, and of course they dress differently. They use this baby talk, this meta speech or meta talk, and they are far better, protected in this way. So again, another meme of mine, and that I borrowed from a friend of mine, from a colleague of mine, Alain de Benoit. Communism kills the body, but it leaves the soul, more or less. Whereas liberal system, transgender system now we live in Western Europe, in Europe and in the United States, it kills the soul, which is far worse. It does not resort to truncheons. It does not resort to a physical violence. It does not resort, although it might one of these days very well, but it uses drugs. It uses this all type of different lifestyles, which have absolutely no sense whatsoever, which defy the basic rules and laws of biology. And yes, it's quite successful. I know young kids, who just simply, sometimes they ask me, as young students in their late teens or early 20s, they ask me, Tom, what do you suggest to me? I'm being bombarded with this Kinsley stuff, with this Kinsley prose, and I frankly don't know what to tell. They didn't ask me about how to get operated and how to change their genitals, but I would not rule out that if this continues, this may be far more successful than the communist gulag. Again, this is my meme, my cliche. If Stalin had been a little bit more successful, he could have made plantations of marijuana in Georgia, Gruzia. It was a constituent republic of the Soviet Union. Grows very good marijuana, by the way. I know it firsthand. So, by the way, it would have been a far better way of neutering, of killing, of neutralizing opponents than by shipping them into the martyrdom, into the Gulag archipelago. So basically, this is what I fear most. What may be the case in the United States of America with these different laws now enacted. Hopefully it will not be going to be. There are still some good people, like in Florida, like in the governor in Florida, DeSantis, and the governor in Arizona as well. There are some also good politicians as well in the States and also in Europe. But, people are not courageous enough. This is what I'm surprised, and especially in academia. I know it firsthand. There are people who tap me on my shoulder. When I'm done with your show, they will tap me on my shoulder, but they just don't want to lose their perks. They don't want to lose their tenures, and they just keep quiet. They don't want to rock the boat because they want to preserve their pension funds. Anyway, I could go on and on, Simon. And again, I certainly would be very pleased we can continue for another 10 or 15 minutes, but then we got to break off, and I need to stretch my legs a little bit. So please do ask me some provocative questions, and we can announce a different show. And I'm sorry, I don't have my tie, but next time I'll have my tie. It's getting hot here. It's 35 degrees here on the island of Krk. It's very, very hot.
It's okay. Professor, I think now is a good time to end the interview. We've been going for over an hour, but I think it would be fantastic if we could pick up where we left off, or where we are leaving off, next Thursday, if you're available, if you've got nothing better on your agenda, in your diary. If you're willing, it would be lovely to have a follow-up conversation with you.
That would be very nice. In fact, you can keep me, I'll give you my word. It's 99% certain, because I'll be back on Thursday in Zagreb, where I'm better equipped with my electricity, electronics and everything, except there's a huge renovation going on in the house where I live, So I guess I will be all set by 7 p.m. and then we can continue our discussion. And I certainly would like to discuss a little bit about this communism as an anthropology. And why not?
Yes.
For my friends and for my look, I'd like to speak a little bit negatively, if you don't mind, about victimhoods, the religionhood of victimhoods. I'm not going to be too explicit, and you know why, but this religion of victimhoods, that we are whites are responsible for all victims worldwide. Despite the fact that slavery was not just the monopoly of whites, it was also monopoly of other races and other people. I'd like to tackle on that, and I would certainly like to say a few words about this genetic loss. Genetischer Verfall, the Germans call it, the great Nobel Prize winner Konrad Lorenz. You got to read him in German, a great guy. I'd like to suggest some literature to your students, some high academic literature. I'd like to say a few words about my books in French and in English as well, if you don't mind. So we can continue on that, and I'll be very pleased. And please rest assured, I'll be very happy to be of some help, and hopefully I'll be able to visit you in South Africa soon. Drop me a line, Simon, and God bless you. You take care of yourself. And if you have a last question, go ahead. I'm all yours for one more minute.
Well, I don't have a last question, Professor Tom, but I think what will suffice is to say yes, 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 and yes to your suggestions. We'd love to hear about your books. We'd love to expose ourselves more and more to understandings which have not been common in our circumstances. And it's not as self-deprecating as you might think, Prof, because on the other hand, we can brag and boast all day and all night about how a tiny population of just about 4.5 million white people in South Africa has created an organization like Suidlanders, which far, by 100 country miles, exceeds anything that has been achieved in Europe or the United States. In other words, a true ethno-homogeneous, inward-looking self-defense organization under international law. We are bracing ourselves for a crisis in an effective way under the leadership of Mr. Gustav Müller. First came up with this idea and implemented it and nurtured it and cultivated it and has grown it to where it is. We're bracing ourselves in a way like nobody in Europe is bracing themselves for the things that they expect. In other words, I could go to Berlin and hold a super intellectual conversation just at a cafeteria, a marketplace cafeteria. But those people will never do anything. Yes, there's some activity, but you cannot compare it to what we're achieving. So this intellectual exposure is fantastic for us, but it's not to say that, we're no good and we're the poor cousin or the black sheep or whatever the case may be. We consider ourselves far more vibrant, far stronger than any other ethno-conscious people in the world, in the USA, in Canada, in all of Western Europe, in Australia and New Zealand. There's nobody to compare to Suidlanders and a smattering of similar organizations to Suidlanders. But again, back to the point, it's great to get the other thing, the not so practical side, the more intellectual side, a better understanding of what lies behind all of this stuff that we experience daily. In 2020, the research results came out recently. The number of farm attacks and farm murders increased by 40-something% over 2019. 40-something%. Last night, I held a conversation with a gentleman who's a new incomer to Van der Kloof, the little village in which I live. And he told me why he left Bopsfontein. He used to live in Bopsfontein, up north in the old Transvaal. It was because his home was attacked, which is a farm, what we call a plot, kind of a mini farm, was attacked by 9 men. And he said that's not the worst of it. Shortly before, his neighbors, a couple, had been tied to their chairs and set alight, murdered that way. While we were talking, his wife walked in and said, "Have you told Simon about what happened this morning in Bopsfontein, where we used to live?" He said, "Oh, yes." And he proceeded to play me. This is last night, yesterday evening. I went to pick up something from this guy. He's helping me with something. He's a good man. He played me the WhatsApp voice recording note of this man and his family huddled in a cupboard while the burglars are going through the house. And this today we found out that the wife was raped and the husband was grievously assaulted. This is in one tiny, minuscule location. This is the kind of stuff that's happening all of the time. It's wonderful for us to not only experience that misery, but to experience the hope and the education of the sorts of level that people like yourself and Kevin MacDonald speak on. It's wonderful. It's marvelous for us.
We'll have also General Glasnovic on it. Well, thank you very much. And I certainly am looking forward to next week. And please try to inform me about some feedback from your viewers and your listeners. And I also hope to have it posted on my website, so you can send me the link. Well, thank you very much for your attention. Again, I would like to extend my best greetings to Afrikaners, and hopefully, folks, if I ever become a president, which can never be ruled out, I'd certainly be more than happy to have you relocated all here in Croatia. Croatia has 4.5 million people, but it can easily, put up with 5 million more. So I certainly would be that's my ideal. But it's worth working for. Everything is possible. You just have to have a strong willpower. Thank you very much, Simon. I gotta go now.
Thank you very much, Professor. We look forward to seeing you next week. May God bless and keep you. And may he bless the work that you are doing for our Christian